Hey everyone, welcome to chapter 5, where we are going to be talking about the rejection of liberalism. And we are going to be talking specifically about Germany during the Nazi Germany regime and Russia during the Soviet Union. So we're going to use those two examples to talk about kind of some extreme rejections of liberalism in its entirety. Now, you should remember from Social 20, both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were used to describe ultranationalism. These were two countries and societies that took nationalism to the extreme, and they also took ideology to the extreme. Um, but these societies didn't exist just for the heck of it. There were lots of things that led up to and created these societies. So, the one primary factor responsible for the rejection of liberalism in both Nazi Germany and Russia, soon to be Soviet Union, was that people in these countries were desperate. The country was in economic and political turmoil, and they needed a solution to their problems. And they were open to almost any new idea to help solve these problems and get them out of the conditions that they were in. We're going to talk about that a little bit more specifically. So, in both countries, the people felt that all hope was gone. And then someone stepped forward saying they had a solution to their problems. People listened and opened their minds to these new ideas. And that's how these totalitarian leaders came to rule. So we're going to start with the Soviet Union. So here is a video about kind of how the Soviet Union began, and then we'll talk about it after.
This video was sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. It's a service where you have instantaneous access to lectures by top professors. One of these lectures inspired the creation of this video, so stay tuned till the end to find out more. When many people think about the history of Russia, this comes to mind. The Soviet Union, its reign over the 20th century, the Cold War, and its eventual fall. But what isn't talked about as much was before this. After all, the Soviet Union had to rise from something, so what exactly was Russia before the revolution? Well, as many of you know, Russia was controlled by a czar. Functioning as all-powerful king of the land, the Tsar was believed to be endowed with this power from God himself, so questioning him wasn't often tolerated. By the late 19th century, Russia had been controlled by the Romanov family, a dynasty which had ruled for nearly 300 years. Russia had a distinct culture ingrained with its heavily orthodox religious beliefs. Stability? Sure. But at the same time, you had the obvious faults with the Tsarist system, as with any authoritarian system. Class division was strict and integral to society. You had the poor, the middle class, the elite. You were born in a class, and moving about was just not likely. While this worked for much of history, the advent of the printing press, better education, and better technology in general began to educate a previously uneducated lower class. Apparently clear in 1881, Alexander II, Tsar of Russia, was brutally killed in an explosion caused by revolutionaries. Unrest had begun, but it would take a lot more than that to take down 3 centuries of Romanov rule. His successor, Alexander III, ruled with this threat in mind. His father dead, it was apparent that revolutionaries were out to end the Tsardom. Appeasement would not be tolerated, nor would it be likely even to help. So active countermeasures were taken. Intelligence agencies in an early form arose to find any potential revolutionary actions. It's here that we meet this man. He has a Russian name, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But he's also known as Sasha, so let's call him that. He was a revolutionary seeking out Alexander III's death. Him, along with other revolutionaries, prepared to kill the Tsar as he paid his respects to his father in 1887. However, the intelligence agency had gotten word and rounded up the group. Alexander III offered the option that if the group were more or less claiming their actions were wrong, their punishment would be spared. Sasha refused, and he was hanged. Why is this important? Well, Sasha was the older brother of Vladimir Lenin. With his brother dead at the hands of Russia, Vladimir was obviously upset. He took up the same path as his older sibling, joining revolutionary movements for the few decades. But in the meantime, the Tsardom had its own troubles. Alexander III, at a relatively young age of 49, died. As with any dynasty, dying too young can be a major issue. Alexander III's son, Nicholas II, was not too young at the age of 26, but he grew up in a life of luxury without struggle. He had not experienced enough nor knew enough to rule Russia. And it's here that the fall of Russia begins. War with Japan in 1904 and 1905, the causes of which are not important to this, puts the Tsar's capabilities to the test. Russia loses, and this is a pretty big deal back in the early 1900s. Asian militaries were seen as greatly inferior to the more developed nations, and this loss began to promote the idea that the Tsar was not capable, nor his rule ordained by God. Soldiers were frustrated, or dead, and the public viewed him in a pretty negative light. What would follow would cement this. Protesters had gathered outside the Winter Palace under relatively peaceful circumstances. They had petitioned for more fair work environments, and while they approached the Tsar's palace, they were gunned down by the Tsar's guards. Word spread quickly. A non-revolutionary group was killed for no good reason, and the public's doubts for the Tsar turned to anger. So as the next decade passed, another war nailed this in even harder. World War I was a complete mess for Russia. Not enough supplies, weapons, and the Tsar gave himself military control rather than his experienced generals. With over 3 million dead, revolution went from the mind of a few to the lives of many. Some more bad publicity came with a mysterious man visiting the palace every day. Long hair and somewhat odd appearance for someone visiting the Tsar, rumors began spreading about his influence on the royal family. His name was Rasputin. In reality, the Tsar had hired him to heal his ill son. Whether he was mystic or not, or helped at all, is irrelevant. The extended family of the Romanovs were pretty embarrassed and horrified by the possible influence of this outsider. Worst of all, some suspected he may be a German, contacting the Tsar regularly during this time of war. So, he was killed. By 1917, the problems of Russia's Tsardom began to boil over. Horrific working conditions and pay, a starving public, and the loss of millions of lives had caused the final ousting of the Tsar. Well, not exactly. He resigned. Believing it would end public animosity and that he was in some way doing a noble act, he immediately attempted to nominate a new Tsar, which obviously declined. The public was not just done with Nicholas II, they were done with the Tsardom in general. This was the February Revolution. From here, a provisional government was set up in the Tsar's place. It wasn't alone, though. The people of Russia were no longer content with this aristocracy, and as such, a socialist governing body also arose, the Petrograd Soviet. They both had control over Russia now, but the differences between the two parties were impossible to reconcile. Nothing could be done. Too much inefficient bureaucracy that left the nation without a true governing body. They did get one thing done, though. When the working class protests broke out that July, the government managed to fight back, and in the process arrested the leader of this Bolshevik faction. Here's where we get back to Vladimir Lenin. He was exiled out of the country, but by October and November, the story had changed. The Bolsheviks had gained a sizable amount of power within the Petrograd Soviets. Eliminating the opposition would ensure complete revolution, and with that, the power amassed by Bolshevik soldiers and leaders led to true revolution. Lenin returned. This was known as the October Revolution, which actually happened in November due to the Gregorian calendar being adopted later. The Bolsheviks had Russia. Well, not uncontested. Two forces, the socialist Bolsheviks and a more diverse white army, fought. Bolshevik mentality was to silence any political idea outside socialism, and within Russia, there was still a good chunk of the population that disagreed. World War I was over. The Soviets made a peace treaty, but this civil war had just begun. In response to this socialist disagreements, former middle class and Tsar loyalists were executed in an event known as the Red Terror. With the secrecy of Russia, this death toll could be anything from thousands to millions. Over the next 5 years, the Soviets' Red Army and the White Army had clashed for control, and obviously we know which side won. The resulting death toll varies, but it's certainly over 5 million people. Through brutal means and near genocide, Lenin finally had control of Russia, but he was also quite ill. During a surgery, he had a stroke and effectively left his high state of power. He still had control, but he was debilitated and knew death was close. With this, he wrote what is known as Lenin's Testament, which intended to function as a layout for the future of Russia. As for leader, it was apparent two options existed: Leon Trotsky, the commander of the Red Army, and General Secretary of the Communist Party Joseph Stalin. In this document, Lenin makes it clear he wants Stalin removed from office, and with that, Trotsky would rule. But Stalin got word of the document early, and through political scheming had it hidden from Russia's Congress. Trotsky was quite the adversary for Stalin. He was critical of his actions in the past, and certainly was more qualified to run the country. Stalin, though, he was willing to do anything for power. Stalin had powerful allies, and keeping Lenin's testament secret meant that he was assured control after Lenin died. Trotsky was treated like any other political enemy, exiled and written out of Russian history. So there you go, the Soviet Union. To go from the authoritarian Tsar to the authoritarian Soviets. Millions of lives gone, and that's just the beginning. Whereas prior, the Tsar had authority, but not quite the power to enforce his iron will. The Soviets had the authority, and they had the power. This is Tyler of Knowledge Hub.
Okay, there was a lot of information in that video, and a lot of it was great. But just at its bare bones is what you need to know. Okay, so basically, Russia started with a royal family, a king, or known there as a czar, through a bunch of different things. Right, a lot of failures of the czar. The Russian public came to say, no, that's not what we need anymore. And the decision by revolutionaries was that socialism was the answer. And so that's how kind of the Soviet Union began. We're going to go to the next slide. So in Russia, it's not working. Okay, so in Russia, from 1860 to 1900, Russia went through many radical changes, right? Industrialization, the introduction of manufacturing, technical enterprise into an area, society, or country. But the country was still far behind the same changes going elsewhere. The political structure remained autocratic meaning the power in the hands of one person, and those in charge did not want to give up control. So we had serious issues going on in Russia. So when the Tsar was assassinated, his son took over and imposed stricter political control. This included the persecution and exiling of liberals. The people were subject to difficult social and economic conditions. Vladimir Lenin stepped in and promised to change, and to fix all the problems of the peasants, low-income workers, and others. There's a really important word that you would have learned in Social 20 that you're going to hear a lot as well in Social 30, and that's the proletariat. Proletariat meaning working class. So Vladimir Lenin really tried to appease to that proletariat, that working class, to say, hey, you're not being treated well. We shouldn't have the class structures that we do. He felt the only way to bring this change was via a revolution, and a violent revolution at that. Right? The people were so desperate they believed him. As a result, Russia experienced the November Revolution, a civil war, February Revolution, to change what was going on. Okay, so here's another video in terms of the rise of the Soviet Union.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's actions of the past few years have led some to suggest he may be trying to reinstate the former Soviet Union. So how exactly did the Soviet Union rise to power? Well, the history of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics begins with the end of the Russian Tsardom. For hundreds of years, Russia was ruled by a series of monarchs called czars, who wielded absolute authority. But in the early 20th century, Russia suffered a series of demoralizing military defeats, both in the Russo-Japanese War and during World War I. These failures were coupled with brutality from Tsar Nicholas II. The state of affairs eventually prompted a revolt from revolutionary groups who rejected rule by elites, instead encouraging rule by the working class. The most notable of these were the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. In 1917, two back-to-back revolutions first ousted the Tsar, then replaced the interim government with local groups of workers known as Soviets. The following year, the Tsar and his entire family were summarily executed. Shortly thereafter, a civil war between loyalists, known as the Whites, and revolutionaries, called the Reds, broke out. The Reds won and unified under the communist ideology, creating the first socialist state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in 1922. Vladimir Lenin was instituted as the leader of the state, and the Bolsheviks were renamed the Communist Party. Lenin nationalized the country's industries, particularly manufacturing and banking, and distributed land amongst its citizens. Those who opposed him were either executed or imprisoned in concentration camps in a campaign known as the Red Terror. Although Lenin died just 2 years after the formation of the USSR, his cult of personality was used throughout its history to promote a political ideology known as Marxism-Leninism, a derivation of communism. After Lenin's death, another revolutionary Bolshevik, Joseph Stalin, gained power despite serious opposition from Lenin in his final years. This opposition was kept secret from the public, and Stalin effectively became a dictator in the Soviet Union. He focused on rapid industrialization and turning the country into a major economic power. Although Stalin's series of 5-year plans to transform the state were generally successful, they came at a severe cost. Millions were unjustly imprisoned in labor camps called gulags. An intentional famine killed millions more, in short, because workers were unable to eat their own grain as it was considered state property under socialism. In the 1930s, Stalin implemented a campaign known as the Great Purge to execute or exile anyone who was a potential threat to communism, including intellectuals and politicians. As the ruler during World War II, Stalin made a peace pact with Nazi Germany. When Germany broke the pact and attempted to invade in 1941, Stalin sent millions of citizens to their deaths to defend the country, successfully pushing back the siege. In the aftermath of World War II, Stalin's regime funded communist uprisings in other countries, creating conditions for the Cold War against the Western and capitalist United States. Stalin died in 1953, and
So we're going to end there. We're going to get into the Cold War later on in this unit. But that gives you another kind of description of the rise of the Soviet Union. So moving on from the USSR, we are going to talk about Nazi Germany and fascism. Okay, so we'll start with kind of how Hitler came to power, how fascism became the ideological choice to solve the problems. Um, so we're going to start with talking about World War One and the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles, lots of people argue, was the cause of World War II, and it was also the cause of kind of Hitler's popularity and fascism as that ideological choice, right? So the Treaty of Versailles basically told Germany that they were at fault for World War One, that they had to pay reparations, among other things. So Germany was left in a lot of debt from World War One. The Great Depression worsened this situation. So not only was the economy doing really poorly, but they were also having to pay back any revenue that they did have to the Allies. And people were desperate for an answer and a way out of this struggle. So in comes fascism, and in comes Hitler and Nazi Germany. Here's a great video on how Hitler rose to power.
How did Adolf Hitler, a tyrant who orchestrated one of the largest genocides in human history, rise to power in a democratic country? The story begins at the end of World War I. With the successful Allied advance in 1918, Germany realized the war was unwinnable and signed an armistice ending the fighting. As its imperial government collapsed, Civil unrest and worker strikes spread across the nation. Fearing a communist revolution, major parties joined to suppress the uprisings, establishing the parliamentary Weimar Republic. One of the new government's first tasks was implementing the peace treaty imposed by the Allies. In addition to losing over a tenth of its territory and dismantling its army, Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war and pay reparations, debilitating its already weakened economy. All this was seen as a humiliation by many nationalists and veterans. They wrongly believed the war could have been won if the army hadn't been betrayed by politicians and protesters. For Hitler, these views became obsession, and his bigotry and paranoid delusions led him to pin the blame on Jews. His words found resonance in a society with many anti-Semitic people. By this time, hundreds of thousands of Jews had integrated into German society, but many Germans continued to perceive them as outsiders. After World War I, Jewish success led to ungrounded accusations of subversion and war profiteering. It cannot be stressed enough that these conspiracy theories were born out of fear, anger, and bigotry, not fact. Nonetheless, Hitler found success with them. When he joined a small nationalist political party, his manipulative public speaking launched him into its leadership and drew increasingly larger crowds. Combining anti-Semitism with populist resentment, the Nazis denounced both communism and capitalism as international Jewish conspiracies to destroy Germany. The Nazi Party was not initially popular. After they made an unsuccessful attempt at overthrowing the government, the party was banned, and Hitler jailed for treason. But upon his release about a year later, he immediately began to rebuild the movement. And then in 1929, the Great Depression happened. It led to American banks withdrawing their loans from Germany, and the already struggling German economy collapsed overnight. Hitler took advantage of the people's anger, offering them convenient scapegoats and a promise to restore Germany's former greatness. Mainstream parties proved unable to handle the crisis, while left-wing opposition was too fragmented by internal squabbles. And so, some of the frustrated public flocked to the Nazis, increasing their parliamentary votes from under 3% to over 18% in just 2 years. In 1932, Hitler ran for president, losing the election to decorated war hero General von Hindenburg. But with 36% of the vote, Hitler had demonstrated the extent of his support. The following year, advisors and business leaders convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor, hoping to channel his popularity for their own goals. Though the chancellor was only the administrative head of parliament, Hitler steadily expanded the power of his position. While his supporters formed paramilitary groups and fought protesters in the streets, Hitler raised fears of a communist uprising and argued that only he could restore law and order. Then, in 1933, a young worker was convicted of setting fire to the parliament building. Hitler used the event to convince the government to grant him emergency powers. Within a matter of months, freedom of the press was abolished, other parties were disbanded, and anti-Jewish laws were passed. Many of Hitler's early radical supporters were arrested and executed, along with potential rivals. And when President Hindenburg died in August 1934, it was clear there would be no new election. Disturbingly, many of Hitler's early measures didn't require mass repression. His speeches exploited people's fear and ire to drive their support behind him and the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, businessmen and intellectuals wanting to be on the right side of public opinion endorsed Hitler. They assured themselves and each other that his more extreme rhetoric was only for show. Decades later, Hitler's rise remains a warning of how fragile democratic institutions can be in the face of angry crowds and a leader willing to feed their anger and exploit their fears.
One of the biggest differences that you've probably noticed between how the Soviet Union came to power and Nazi Germany came to power is what kind of political system existed before them, right? So in Germany, it was a democracy. Hitler came to power under democratic means and then took power later on. Whereas the Soviet Union, it was a totalitarian regime in terms of a royal family had all political control, and they overthrew that royal family in means of revolution. So, at that time, Hitler seemed to be the man with all the answers. He convinced the German people that he had the solutions to help the country, and his solution was to cleanse the country of Jewish people and other undesirables, such as gays, gypsies, other religious groups that didn't fall in line. The people were all so desperate that this kind of absurd idea actually seemed reasonable and legitimate. One way in which so many totalitarian regimes maintain power is to direct all of the anger of people towards a certain group or something other than themselves or other than the government, right? And also using scapegoats like the Jewish people. So the Nazi party eventually guided the Germans to rejecting principles of liberalism, such as individual rights and freedoms. It became illegal to marry or have children with undesirables. And the liberal concept of rule of law was also done away with. There was no longer kind of equal treatment under the law. So there's lots of important groups when talking about the Nazi Party. Here is three of them: the Gestapo, and it was the official secret police of Nazi Germany, and it was responsible for dealing out harsh measures of political opponents who registered the Nazi doctrine. So any communists or socialists that didn't agree with Nazi principles. The Sturmblag was a parliamentary wing, so many people will call it SA. Its primary purpose was to provide protection for Nazi rallies. They were also known as the brown shirts, and they were superseded by the SS. Okay, and the SS were known as the black shirts, and their primary purpose was the same as the SA, and it was the Beyond that, it was the organization which is most responsible for the genocide killing of Jews during the Holocaust. Okay, so that's all for the notes from me. I highly recommend going back and watching some of those videos if you're ever feeling like you don't know kind of how Nazi Germany or how the Soviet Union came to be. There's a lot of reading in this chapter, but it's a lot of really good reading and a lot of really great information. So I hope you enjoyed doing the chapter 5 assignment. There's also a handout within this lesson. It's a chart to fill out kind of some totalitarian techniques that both Nazi Germany used and the Soviet Union used. So you can do that to kind of get a better handle on totalitarianism. And that's all for me. So enjoy the rest of chapter 5.